Muito bom dia a todos. Good morning to all. I would like to welcome the audience present here at ICBAS, as well as those who are watching us online. My name is Mário Santos. I'm a physician and researcher at UMIB at ICBAS. And together with Professor André, we will discuss the impact of climate changes on cardiovascular disease, which are the main cause of death and premature death in the world, especially in the developed world. I'm very pleased to present our speaker, a friend and colleague. Professor André Luz is an interventional cardiologist at Centro Hospitalar Universitário do Porto and a researcher at UMIB as well. He dedicates most of his time to the treatment and the study of coronary heart disease. But his curiosity a couple of years ago led him to look in more detail to data concerning acute myocardial infarction and temperature here at our city, Porto. We will have some time for Q&A, so please send your questions and comments through the chat box. I will be looking at it and will be very happy to take them. For those who are here, please do the old-fashioned way, raise your hands and share your comments, your thoughts and questions with us. André, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We are looking forward to hear your talk. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Mario. Many thanks for a kind presentation. Mario is a friend of mine and a colleague, and we shared some thoughts about these and other issues. And for me, it's a pleasure to be here. I graduated here a couple of years ago. So it's my pleasure to be a part of this fantastic meeting. This should move on, but it doesn't. I don't know. Yes. No, it's working. Okay, so it's better with this mouse. Okay. So first thing first, do we have a climate change? Maybe we do have a climate change. I don't know what happened again. Oops, maybe here. Okay, I think we have a climate change. Otherwise, people wouldn't gather in the UK for these days. We have a major climate conference. Let's see what they bring us for in the end of this conference. But I'm very happy because most of the most important people in the world gather in Rome and they toss a coin. I think they're making a wish, but I don't know if they're very lucky because I heard that they should toss the coin with their right hand through the left shoulder, and you can see they are doing in the right shoulder. So I don't know if they'll come to an end, but let's hope for the best. So yes, we do have a problem because indeed the temperature of the planet is rising and is exponentially rising from the 80s. So the warmest years are just from 2010 to nowadays. So if you do nothing, this exponentially warming will increase with nefarious effects to human health. And if you look at this picture, this graph, if you have in a high emission scenario, which is usually comprehended by the RCPs, which is a level of radiative forcing that traps the heat in the atmosphere, if you do nothing from 2100, and I'm sure most of us wouldn't be here to know if it's true or false, but the expectation is that the temperature may rise even more than 5 degrees centigrade, which is really a lot. And what are the consequences of this warming? Usually this warming comes from the greenhouse effect, everybody knows it. And of course, there is a multitude of effects from the ecosystems and culminating in our daily living. For example, for populations that grow and fish and live in the seaside, of course, you can have a shortage of fish. You can expect to have floods, hurricanes, droughts, wildfires. And of course, if we do nothing, there is some groups that even can eventually forecast that the next wars for the next century will be due to the searching of commodities like water. So it is poverty, mass migration, and conflicts may arise if you do nothing with respect of climate change. So what about pollution? I think we can't just talk about climate change and cardiovascular effects without looking at pollution, because pollution is the main driver of this climate change. This is a paper from a Journal of American College of Cardiology published in 2018, before the COVID-19 pandemic. As you may appreciate, that the estimate of the premature reversible death is due major in the larger fraction, a sizable amount is due to pollution. I don't know if it's 5 or 4 or 6 million deaths per year, which is directly due to pollution. And talking about pollution, usually the way that scientists usually get involved is when they measure the fine particulate matters, usually less than 2.5 microns. And why? Because more than half of the pollution nowadays is due to these compounds that arise from metals, carbon, and even from households, especially in low to middle income countries, usually still use coal and wood to set fires into kitchen and to cook their meals. And so if you see in this graph here, you see that is mostly in parts of the world with low to middle income countries that the pollution with this kind of fine particulate matters have the greatest annual concentrations. And this is not a forecast, this is real data. This comes from a well-developed country, it's from Canada. The rates of mortality derived from a Canadian cohort with more than 2 million people that followed for 10 years. You can see that the largest the concentration of the particulate matters, then the risk of cardiovascular mortality is increasing. And this is observed data, this is not a forecast anymore. So how do these particulate matters influence vascular biology? Of course, inflammation is everywhere, from cancer to vascular biology. There are plenty of data coming from preclinical experiments showing that not only thrombosis, but atherogenesis as well is influenced negatively by the fine particulate concentrates. Then you have an enhanced oxidative state of these patients, which is a precursor to inflammation and then to problems, to vascular problems, culminating in strokes or myocardial infarction. And almost all people on Earth is exposed to levels which are considered very high or higher than the standards as per the World Health Organization quality guidelines. And short or long-term exposure increase cardiovascular mortality everywhere. So we have here a major risk factor, not only, again, dyslipidemia or diabetes or overweight or hypertension. This is the new risk factor, and maybe it's a reversible risk factor. That is the good news. Now, question 2, does climate influence mortality due to cardiovascular disease? I was in Spain in 2003. I was in Baleares, and I remember I was just looking at the news, and the European continent, the Mediterranean basin, was burning. I remember the wildfires in Alentejo in Portugal. It was really very, 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 very worrisome. And in France and in Greece, likewise. And you see, if you compare to the flanking years of 2003, in August 2003, we have a major augmentation of mortality, which is ascribed to this to the heat that hit the European southern continent. As you may see here, in this graph, the mortality, the excess mortality was very much higher than it was expected to be when you compare to other years flanking the 2003 year. And if you see, for example, the number of calls to the emergency medical services in the area of Paris, you can appreciate that if you compare to 2002 into 2004 and 5, there was a major 2.34 times more cardiac arrests that were held by the SAMU in France. I'm sure you already seen this graph. In a high or a moderate to a high emission scenario between 6 to 8.5 watts per square meter, that's what we have today in many parts of the world. It expected the temperature to rise above 3 to 4 or even 5 degrees centigrades for the next 50 years. And this is a projection because for every degree centigrade that passes this cutoff, then the risk of an additional event like extreme weather events is going to be very possible. So let's not let alone if you have 3 to 4 degrees centigrades, then wildfires, then the global aggregate impacts, large-scale singular events is expected to be very possible. So what is the physiological consequence of heat in the cardiovascular system? Well, many things can happen, from arrhythmias, from cardiac arrest, for hypotension due to heat waves, a kidney injury for the dehydration, and you have a kidney failure, then the cardiovascular mortality rises to several folds. So you have many consequences of this. These are some of their consequences of the heat in the cardiovascular system. What about us? In Portugal, we have a warm, moderate country. According to Copenhagen, mainland Portugal can be roughly divided into climate groups. The southernmost part is the CS group, usually is with hot summers, but usually summers are much more hotter than in the northern part, and we live in the CSB city. So you, as you may appreciate, we don't have extreme insults in the winter or for the summer. So that led us a question: what happens in our cohort in our city when it comes to myocardial infarction? So this was a paper. It's already accepted for publication. We did it with our students from the ICBAS, and we tried to look what happened to the risk of ST elevation myocardial infarction in our city. You looked at the previous 1,000 patients that were treated during 7 years at our center, confirmed by coronary angiography. This is very important because, well, I'm an intervention cardiologist. For me, it's easier. Then I just confirm that the patients really had a myocardial infarction. This is not codification. Sometimes codification can have some bias. So if you go to the regulatory boards, they can have codification, and codification is sometimes you can have some problems with it. So this is confirmed, pinpointed by all patients that entered our service to be treated. Of course, this was gathered by 3 stations that covers a sizable amount of our patients referred to our center, and the methodology to do this is, of course, pretty much the same like papers published in literature like this. This is the main graph. You can appreciate that the distribution of myocardial infarction is much lower in the warmer months from June to September, then starts to increase with the decreasing temperature, ambient temperature, and then starts to decrease until March when temperature starts to rise. Then there is some effect here in April and in May that we don't have a simple explanation for it. But anyway, you may just realize that, and we empirically know that the procurement of patients in our hospital it's much higher in the colder months than in the peak of the summer. And this is the results. Then you have in this graph here the excess relative risk for acute myocardial infarction after each drop in minimum temperature, for maximum temperature, for mean temperature, the temperature range, and the risk for acute myocardial infarction after 1% increase in relative humidity, and finally for an increase in atmospheric pressure. So the main conclusions were that a drop in the minimum temperature 2 days before the event is associated with a higher, nearly 2% higher risk of having a myocardial infarction for each temperature, for each degree drop, which is here, so black 2 days before the event, and for an increase in the relative humidity in the previous 3 days is also associated with almost 1% increased risk to having a myocardial infarction with ST elevation. So this is a pretty much like paper like ours. The difference is 10 times more patients, of course. We're talking about Paris, Grand Paris. So again, it's ST elevation myocardial infarction as confirmed by angiography, like in our series, and temperature again and influenza were associated with an excess risk, and the magnitude of the risk is pretty much the same. They found that an excess of risk during consecutive days following a 10 degrees decrease of maximum temperature. In our case, it was minimum temperature. So, and the major epidemiological studies say pretty much the same. So we are expecting a seasonality effect from winter deaths, cardiovascular deaths, usually due to myocardial infarction, except for the patients who live, population live in the north, in the high latitudes, maybe because they had a long time ago taken measures that to accommodate, preventive measures to accommodate cold. And so these kind of relationships are not so observed in the higher latitudes. I'm sorry. What about humidity? This is a paper came from China. You can appreciate that humidity goes hand in hand with the particulate matters of 2.5, as I showed you a couple of slides ago. And well, it's tempting to speculate, but we didn't measure, unfortunately, the relative humidity. But I think it's tempting to speculate that maybe the reason behind we had a high risk of myocardial infarction 3 days after an increase in relative humidity in Porto, maybe it's due to it's a surrogate marker of fine particulate matters in suspension in the atmosphere, but unfortunately we didn't measure. This is, if anyone wants to this database and proceed with this measure, I'll be very glad to help you. So why does cold really impact cardiovascular health? Of course, there is some from vasoconstriction from cold, platelet activation, diuresis and dehydration. So everything that can put a higher rheological factor in the vascular system is expected, is plausible to enhance the risk of a vascular event, either a cardiac event or a cerebrovascular event. So this is good news. So if you have a warming planet, maybe cardiovascular deaths will decrease. I don't know if this is so true, but maybe it's not so far away from true. But if you look at this is an extrapolation. It's a model, a complex model from a multi-city, multi-ethnic, multi-country model. If you look at communities and mean percent change of heat waves related from the next following years as compared to the last 50 years, under a high emission scenario, with a high variant population scenario, and with the assumption of another adaptation, which is key for the magnitude of effects when you're talking about climate change and with a hand in pollution. And you can appreciate that usually are people who live in tropical, subtropical areas who fear the most or should fear the most heat waves as may increase in time. So maybe yes in winter in high latitudes, but it's usually offset by heat waves in other regions. And this is an asymmetrical hit because sometimes people have comorbid disease, which are of course much more prone to this climate change that impacts differently age and gender, and of course their location, the socioeconomic status, the exposure, and of course this is, we're not talking about an asymmetric risk factor. There are some scientists that say that maybe warming may reduce cold spells in some regions, okay? But cold spells are not very likelihood of and the magnitude of effect in cardiovascular mortality is not so high. So much more important is long-term temperature increase than these cold spells. And of course, from a political and from a practitioner point of view, there are many ways to tackle this problem and to help patients and community to adapt to this problem, from regulation, from legislation, from awareness, from social media, and so on. Just to finish, I'm almost finishing. Just to almost finish my presentation. As you can see here, independently from the RCT, you may find a.
Já vamos, queres vir? Queres vir até logo? Queres vir?
Gostava de pedir que ligarem os vossos micros. Judite Lopes Barbosa, eu acho que é daí que vem o som. Eu não consigo ligar.
Tens de ligar tudo.
Não. Ok. Não consigo, não tenho autorização para.
A criança já está a ver televisão?
Estava muito calor.
Estava muito calor. So just to finishing, if you can appreciate that in a scenario of a high variant population, so increasing population, and with assumption of full adaptation, you can see that richer countries can adapt much better, and the rising of the heat wave mortality, its related mortality is much higher, lower than if you can go for other countries with eventually without the same capacity of adaptation. So in conclusion, climate change is here for staying and is linked to air pollution. This impacts to a great extent mortality. The heat wave related mortality is related mostly to greenhouse emissions, and with human adaptation, of course, is key to adapt to this climate change. We can appreciate a variation in cardiovascular mortality, namely myocardial infarction, in colder months, especially in warmer countries like ours. And awareness of vulnerable populations, healthcare providers, I think is justified and never overemphasized. And finally, climate change and global warming may reduce winter-related deaths. However, this variation always exists, and is of course offset by other problems which may, in the end of the day, augment the risk of cardiovascular mortality. Well, I don't know if this is last call. This is the front page of Time. Let's hope for the best. Thank you.
Thank you, André, for your excellent and very comprehensive presentation. We'll already have one question from the chat. I will encourage everyone here to put the questions if you want. I will start, and then we'll ask this question from the audience. I will start saying that your local study, I think it has many layers of interpretation. It raises a lot of hypotheses, but it has a significant virtue. At least when I was hearing you, and I already had the access to the slides before. I think this kind of local studies are a very powerful communication to speak to common people, lay people, about what we are talking about. It's not the polar bear that are threatened, is our risk of having a heart attack, which is a very familiar disease. I would like you to share with us, when you talk about this with your coworkers, healthcare personnel, or lay people, what kind of feedback did you have? What kind of experience did you have?
Thank you. First of all, I try to be not on call on colder days, okay? Because it's expected to be called many times to the cat lab. No, I'm just kidding you. No, of course, why did you do this study in the first place? Because we had the impression that in colder months, we had 1, 2, 3 calls a day. So what's happening here? So why this is really happening? And then if you go to the main epidemiological publications, usually is from locations that had other kind of climates as ours. And what I saw, it's the main results is we have this pretty much the same excess risk as compared to warmer countries, independent of is Mediterranean warm or not, or continental temperatures. For the second question, how do I talk with patients? In the same way that we talked before. If I have a patient that has some chronic disease, and usually we have patients with already known coronary artery disease, and sometimes they with a plethora of common risk factors. Of course, if I say you should lower your blood sugar, you should lower your cholesterol, and be aware of cold. So that's the main message that I can tell them. I think I'm not the proper person to say to the patient, look, this is derived from climate change, which is also derived from greenhouse effect. It's pointless to do it in a medical room.
Thank you. So I will ask the question that Inês Garrido sent. Do you think that the higher myocardial infarction in April and May, rather than March, for instance, could be associated to spring allergies? Nice hypothesis. Do you know that if the same scenario happens in other countries, or it was something about Porto? For example, countries like Germany or Norway tend to have buildings with more controlled temperature. Here in Portugal, the same does not happen so frequently. Do you think that if the temperatures inside our homes would be more stable during the year, the same scenario would not happen? So 2 hypotheses to explain that peak.
Many questions, one answer, I don't know. From the allergies, there is one paper, I think I remember to read one paper, that the allergies tend to increase. We're talking about cardiovascular mortality, but we never can neglect other problems, especially respiratory tract problems related to greenhouse effect. And allergies and pollens are one of the causes that can enhance the risk of procurement for patients who have these chronic disabilities. I don't know if I don't have a simple explanation. We just look at the data, and the reviewers of the paper, they didn't come with nothing. So I don't know if it's an effect that maybe it could be deeply looked, but I don't have a clear explanation for it. For the second comment, of course, it has to be a great limitation of this kind of studies. That is a major limitation. It's across all studies. We're measuring ambient temperature. We don't even not even measuring in-house temperature, much less body temperature. So it's completely different things. So although you can always extrapolate that ambient temperature can be a surrogate and can be a marker, which is much easily measured than other variables. But yes, the reason why colder regions or countries are better prepared and this magnitude of effect is not so observed, that because they take precautionary measures against cold. There were some other papers that just tried to eventually look at risk factors. For example, in colder months, people don't go outside, don't do much less exercise work, and even can have a higher caloric intake. But altogether, the net result is no. Usually, in the war in these countries, and there was a paper a couple of years ago that I think Portugal was the third or the second from the beginning, from the bottom, where the mortality in winter was much higher than our counterparts from the center and north of Europe. I think it was 90s. I didn't show it because I want to believe that it's not the case anymore.
Okay, thank you. Professor Vasconcelos. Sorry?
Well, thank you. Very nice talk and work. And probably I didn't, two questions, didn't hear. Are the patients different, those that have the myocardial infarction in the cold and comparing with other seasons? I mean, regarding age, comorbidities and so on. And second is, as I feel the obligation to think more and more about One Health, I'm asking you, I remember 20 years ago a paper from the North Scandinavia, I think, about microbial viruses like CMV and relation with myocardial infarction. So I wonder if there are different viruses regarding the weather. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Vasconcelos. For the second part of your question, the only paper that I found between a relationship between virus and mortality in winter was this paper, French paper, that correlated only influenza and temperature. And the magnitude of effect is even higher for influenza infection than for temperature, for a higher risk for a cardiovascular mortality, especially for myocardial infarction. For the first question that you have made, we look at the data. We didn't find any differences in the major epidemiological factor, demographic factors that could impede to differentiate this. In order to look with more deepness for risk factors, for example, there are one or two papers that looked at diabetics and for patients with heart failure. Of course, these populations are much more at risk, and the mortality is very much is higher. But the statistician told me that you have to do many models to one by one in order to test the hypothesis. Let's see what happened to the octogenarians, let's see what happens to diabetics. Then you would need a sample with at least 10 times more than the 1,000 patients.
So thank you. Can I put another question?
Yes.
I would like to ask you to put your healthcare manager hat and tell us about the practical consequences on how organizing our institutions, health hospitals in particular. So you know that it will be more and more frequent, the demand of healthcare on these heat waves or cold waves. We will have a lot of resource utilization in a short period of time, a couple of weeks. How should we be preparing ourselves to treat all those patients? are any worldwide institutions that are already doing this work? Can you share with us your?
Yes, richer countries, yes, of course, they get prepared. The emergency response teams are reinforced, of course, and in order to tackle the mortality which is expected in the procurement that is expected. Of course, from an economical point of view, you have always the frontier of possibilities in production. So if you allocate too much resources to one thing, then you ultimately forget other things. So you have to take care that it's not always it's not only cardiovascular disease. Otherwise, you risk to forget other things. So yes, the simple question is the answer is yes. Of course, you should reinforce teams. You should aware people that work in the university departments, and maybe in our institution, in our service, because of course we are limited resources. It's a problem in economy. The resources are not infinite. Maybe we learned sometimes that, for example, on Mondays, for example, in January and from November to January, we tried to not to schedule too many patients to do heart catheterization on Mondays, because we know beforehand that during the weekend you can face a crescendo of patients. So otherwise, we would risk to have not enough places for everyone. So we tried to settle a little bit the risk to benefit ratio, what patients should be scheduled in program procedures in order to have some room for the emergency ones.
Okay, we have to work a lot on this, please.
For microphone. Thank you very much. I would like to go back to this issue of temperature in Porto or in the north of Portugal. I mean, do you have access to the socioeconomic profile of those patients? Because we know that in Portugal, we think that we live in a climate that does not need heating or air conditioning, right? But we know also that electricity is very expensive, and for heating and for cooling down rooms, we need electricity. Do you know if the people who are at a higher risk of having myocardial infarction are people from lower social status?
No, it's a very interesting question, but no, we don't have. It will be interesting to the database is already done. You can of course add some variables and eventually to know if we can see other. This is a very important aspect. However, our hospital, well, this is for those who are not familiar with it. We have three tertiary care hospitals in the Porto region, and each of it receives patients from dedicated areas. They're much more confined. There are some patients that come from one area to other, but it's not very. It's a small city, nevertheless, and our major reference referral area is the eastern part of Porto, which is, as we may know, not very fantastic from a social perspective. But we also have the richest part of Porto, which is Foz. So it's a mixture. So I don't know. It would be very interesting to have an epidemiological, sociological addenda to this paper, but I don't have an answer to give you.
You don't have the data, but we know already the answer. The poorer will be mostly affected by these
as always
changes.
Yes, of course.
So do we have to close the? Okay, so I have a last question that I would like to hear from André. We are in modern medicine, we always look at technology to solve our problems. And in cardiology, in cardiovascular medicine, the breakthroughs has been really amazing during the last decades. The nature of this problem is different, because when you have a heated organism, I'm a little bit skeptical about the true power of technology to help us dealing with these kind of situations. Probably the most effective answers will be from our colleagues from public health. But do you have more hope than me on the on the help of technology? I know monitoring, treatments.
No, I think it's maybe it's big data. Okay, I think it's computational systems, and those we are in informatics and bioinformatics can have a better look, because they can gather a huge amount of information. Okay, and then they can tell us what is most important things to look for, like the question that was recently raised, like the socioeconomic impacts or the demographics of the population. Yes, you can have all this information if you gather lots of people, lots of information. Then you have to treat it with big data, computing. I'm not, of course, the guy to talk about it, but yes, I think technology can solve these kind of problems, especially preventing problems to arise. Okay, so and pinpointing which are the population that we should take care most. Of course, you can prevent not everything. That's not that's impossible. But I think we can just focus in a series of populations that need the most from our attention.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are on time. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening to this very interesting presentation, very interesting discussion. So thank you very much.